Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very special and important conversation regarding elders and dependent adults during COVID-19. My name is Sabrina Farrell, and I am an Assistant District Attorney and the Executive Director of the Alameda County Family Justice Center. In my 20 years as a prosecutor, nearly half of that time I've spent in and as the head of the Elder Protection Unit. It is my pleasure to bring you this panel of powerhouses to discuss the important issues that we've seen over the last couple of months and where do we go from here. Starting with the Honorable Victor Rodriguez. He was appointed to the Alameda County Superior Court in 2017, and since June of 2018, he has presided over a dedicated civil domestic violence restraining order department, which now includes elder abuse and gun violence restraining orders. He is the chair of the court's Family Violence Council. Before being appointed to the bench, he most recently worked as the judicial staff attorney for various California Supreme Court justices. And thank you, Your Honor, for being our moderator today, and thank you for co-sponsoring this event, and the Family Violence Council co-sponsoring this event with the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. Our panelists include Vanessa Baker, and she is a licensed marriage and family therapist who has over 20 years experience providing services to vulnerable populations. She has worked for Alameda County Social Services for over 14 years, providing services to elders, dependent adults, and individuals requiring involuntary mental health treatment in both a direct service capacity and as a social worker. We also have Bridget Lowe, who has been a prosecutor for over 23 years. She is currently assigned to the Elder Protection Unit at the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, where she prosecutes financial and physical abuse perpetrated against elders and dependent adults. Nicole Howell is the Executive Director for the Ombudsman Services of Contra Costa, Solano, and Alameda counties, where she leads a team of staff and volunteers committed to empowering older and disabled adults, particularly those who live in long-term care. And finally, James Trajari has been the Executive Director at Legal Assistance for Seniors since 2015. Before that, he was a staff attorney at LAS, focused on elder abuse and conservatorship cases. Prior to becoming an attorney, he worked as a social worker and homeless and transgender, he worked as a social worker with homeless and transgender youth in Los Angeles and housing development for the homeless in New Hampshire. He also holds a master's degree in social work. So thank you to our panelists. And I'm going to show you the way that we collaborate together and our different systems intersect. And our panelists are going to discuss the different ways that we work together.
Great. I'm going to start. Thank you, Sabrina. First off, I just want to say how excited I am to be here, and a huge thank you to Judge Rodriguez and to Sabrina for putting this together. I think it's a really important conversation that I think we need to keep at the forefront and keep talking about this as we move through COVID and as we move beyond COVID. I think older adults and elder abuse are areas that don't get enough attention these days or have ever gotten enough attention. And so I think this is a really important and valuable conversation. So we're gonna take a moment to kind of table set. I think this is probably information that a lot of you know, but it's still important to kind of review that. Just a reminder that we really are working in an ecosystem when we talk about elder abuse and preventing and combating elder abuse. And so what we have here is kind of a pretty simplified metric of how the different agencies and many others who are involved in this work collaborate and work together. the kind of saying, the saying that I've held on to, you know, since I started this job, is that I have yet to meet the older adult who's come in for legal services who just needed legal services, who didn't need a lot of other support to be thriving in their home and in their community. And so, you know, for legal assistance for seniors, while we're really focused on civil legal remedies, including, you know, working on restraining orders and establishing powers of attorney, that is often almost always paired with other amazing service, many who are in this presentation with me, like Adult Protective Services, Ombudsman Services, the district attorney in the courts. And also, you know, many who aren't on this panel, including, you know, I just got off a call with the Senior Services Coalition of Alameda County, which includes over 60 nonprofits just in Alameda County alone that are supporting older adults in a variety of ways, from food delivery to in-home services to many to day programs to many other types of support needed. And so so this gives you kind of a snapshot of the overview of all of the many systems that it really takes to protect older adults when we see this. And I would turn it over, I'm gonna turn it over just if people wanna make some comments about how their role in this process. I'll start with Bridget.
Thanks, Jim. And thank you also to Judge Rodriguez and Sabrina for putting this together as well. As it relates to prosecuting perpetrators of crimes against elderly victims, I think we have the same experience that legal assistance for seniors has, in that it's very rare that they come in and the only thing that they need from us is for us to prosecute someone who has committed a crime against them. Usually they need all different sorts of services. And what we try to do is create a team, or what we've tried to do is create a team of people. We have sort of a holistic approach to helping them through the criminal justice system, but also helping them with ancillary needs. Like sometimes people will need counseling services or housing, relocation, all sorts of different needs. And our team consists of the district attorney. We have two deputy district attorneys who are designated to prosecute elder prosecution cases, and only elder prosecution cases, as well as dependent adult cases. And then we have lots of other DAs who also help us do that, so that we can keep our caseloads low, so we can give that real individualized attention to each elder who comes through as a victim or witness in our cases, or a dependent adult. And we also have our investigators that work closely with us, as well as our victim advocates. The victim advocates are often involved in doing direct servicing, and working in conjunction with AS, and all sorts of other different appropriate agencies. And I know our office works closely with agencies around the state to come up with new innovative ideas to help victims of crime in this area.
Great, thank you, Bridget. And next I would pass it to Nicole.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate all of your work, and it's a pleasure to work with all of you in Alameda County. So as many of you have heard in recent months and weeks, you've heard a lot about long-term care and skilled nursing specifically. And you're probably like, Ombudsman, what? So I'm here to share with you that Ombudsman is a federally mandated program through the Older Americans Act, and here in California under the Older Californians Act. And we have the distinct privilege of working with individuals who live in licensed long-term care facilities. And for us, that means two primary kinds of facilities. Skilled nursing facilities, which you've probably heard of. You might go after you need a hip replacement, you've had a bad illness, you need some rehab, or you may be there for an extended period of time because you need some medical assistance. And the other side of the umbrella, which is I think what we think of as assisted living, which is you drive by those big fancy buildings on your way home from the grocery store, and they're a little bit like cruise ships. There's activities, there might be some entertainment. That's one kind of facility. And in California, we have a lesser known kind of facility that actually has a lot of residents, We sometimes call them 6-bed facilities. It's the same level of care as that fancy assisted living, but it's in a home-like setting. And you probably pass them in your neighborhood all the time and don't realize that. And so long-term care ombudsmen are charged with making visits to long-term care facilities before there's a problem, build relationships, assist to resolve issues related to quality of care and quality of life. And in California and just a few other states, we also have a charge around elder abuse, meaning we address issues for those residents as it occurs in long-term care, whether that be physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, or any other kind of abuse, and we help to resolve it. Now, it's important to note, we are not the finder of fact. No one gave me a badge or a gun or, like these folks here, a judge or an attorney. What they do is our job is to protect the residents' rights in those scenarios. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Nicole. My wife's grandmother often refers to her long-term facility as her cruise ship, so she's, I guess, one of the fortunate ones who feels like it is a cruise ship. Next, I'll pass it to Vanessa.
Thank you so much, Jim. And as everyone has said, it is such a pleasure to be on this panel and to work with each and every one of you. So again, I'm a program manager with Adult Protective Services, and I've had the pleasure of working in this field for over a decade. I definitely consider myself to be very lucky to be contributing to the continuum of services to help our seniors and dependent adults remain safely in our communities. I think we're all touched by, personally, we have parents and friends and interactions with individuals who really do need our support. So both professionally and personally, it's very rewarding. In terms of adult protective services, what do we do? Well, Nicole talked about the role of the Ombudsman, and of course we work with her office very closely. And one piece that she touched on was jurisdiction. While the Ombudsman's office investigates abuse in long-term care facilities, APS is responsible for investigating abuse in all other types of locations, homes, independent living facilities, which are known as room and boards, hospitals, and any other type of location that really the Ombudsman's office does not investigate in. Our services, and this is really important, our services are voluntary. And the reason why that's so critical is because our staff are really well trained to put on their social work and then investigative hats so that they can build rapport, but also get to the core of what's happening with the victims of abuse. Our services are also very confidential. And the reason why that's important is because if you report abuse, your identity is confidential. And that's really critical because we want to encourage individuals to report to us what they see. We work closely with clients and their families or other caregivers and friends to really develop a plan to help mitigate the abuse and provide a safety net so that individuals can remain safely in our community. And that's where we connect with all of the panelists, because it's not, we have a very specific role, but we work closely with the district attorney around prosecution, legal assistance for seniors from a legal and also a case management standpoint in our Home Safe program, and of course with the courts, and as I mentioned, the Ombudsman. So we really benefit from the continuum of care, and again, I'm happy to be on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And last, but certainly not least, is Judge Rodriguez.
Hi, thank you again for having me. I think this is a vitally important topic. As Jamie was saying, this is an area that under the best of circumstances gets too far little care and focus based on the importance of it. But now, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, for lots of reasons, it's particularly vitally important to talk about what we do and how we can work together. And I think that, as the panelists were saying, a lot of the people who are participating in this call probably know a lot of the architecture that's currently on the screen and what we're talking about, but we need to be mindful that the clients of the people we're trying to protect and support often don't know this. And if they're coming to you all, and if they're coming to the civil court, they're coming at a time that is among the most traumatic and awful of their life. Somebody who they love or who they trust or who has some type of fiduciary obligation to them has abused them. And they just are kind of in a fog in terms of understanding what's going on. And so often in Department 502, where I handle elder abuse along with domestic violence abuse, I have elder clients or litigants who very reasonably say, well, can't you just look in your files and look up the police report? Or can't you just change the criminal protective order from where you are? We have to kind of explain that we have these different agencies, we have these different departments, and we often, for very specific and intentional reasons, have these lines in between probate and criminal and civil, and we don't necessarily put them in contact with. So I think it's important for clients to understand and to make sure that we as advocates and as people who are receiving the claims of the elderly, make sure that we don't have, between all these lines that are on your screen, we don't have someone drop off from one place to another place, that there's a handoff, so that if someone needs help from Ombudsman or from APS or from criminal or civil, that we don't let people just kind of fall into the cracks, because as we hand them off to someone else, because we don't do what is necessary in that particular moment, that handoff is smooth, so that we make sure that everybody gets all the services. So I'm hopeful that this conversation will be a part of that, and I'm very eager to hear from all of our panelists.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of the wonderful audience members here. We are up to over 100 participants. And so clearly throughout Alameda County and beyond, there is a need to have this conversation. Before we go into the panelist discussion, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you have a question for the panelists for the court, you can put that in the Q&A section, but we will be monitoring both the Q&A section and the chat section. Thank you.
Perfect. So why don't we get started? And just to kind of piggyback on something Sabrina said, if you put a question to the Q&A, please make sure to identify yourself so that we know kind of the ambit of who's asking the question, so we can help contextualize that answer. So let's begin. So we are about 7 months into this pandemic. I still remember pretty well on about March 16th, my last day of normalcy at the Hayward Hall of Justice, and having an emergency meeting with all my colleagues and telling us, okay, we're not going to have court tomorrow. Hopefully in a couple of weeks, we're going to go back to normal. And here we are 7 months in. And so what I'm eager to hear from our various panelists is, in this last 7-month period, what did your agency and your colleagues see in terms of the increase, if any, of cases as compared to the compared time period from last year? And Vanessa, maybe we could start with you.
Definitely. Thank you, Judge. So this is a great question, and I was really interested to see if what I thought anecdotally was confirmed by the data, and some pieces were and others weren't. Overall, when we compare the year to date from 2019 to 2020 during this 7-month period, we've seen a decline in overall referrals, with April being our lowest number at 492 reports of abuse received, which was a 23% reduction from the prior year to date. The good news is that we are starting to see a steady increase. So when we look at August and then September, August we received 526, excellent, and September 583. So we're starting to see an increase, which is great news and not unexpected. I have, some theories as to why we've seen a drop, and certainly we'll get into that with future questions. But as many of us are very much aware, seniors can be very isolated, and those who report abuse need to see them to be able to and interact with them to understand that. That abuse is a possible occurrence. What is even more interesting and albeit concerning are really the data that we found on allegations. So among Latina, Hispanic clients and victims, allegations of physical abuse during this time frame are up by 135%. That number is absolutely staggering and incredibly concerning. And also psychological or mental abuse is up by 97% in this same group. Also among Asian and Pacific Islander communities, financial abuse allegations are up by 83% year to date. And also malnutrition and dehydration are up by 38% in this subgroup. And then for those individuals who identify in other ethnic and or multiple ethnic groups or other race groups, we're seeing an increase in physical abuse of 106%. And I will say, when I mentioned initially that I wondered if my anecdotal perceptions were consistent, this is consistent. We have seen a steady rise in physical abuse allegations. And again, there are lots of potential reasons that we can look back if we do another panel in a year. But those are really that's the data that really stood out for us at Adult Protective Services in terms of a comparison year to date.
And then Vanessa, do you have like a baseline? What's an average month of referrals from 2019?
Well, and it's interesting that you ask that, because when we did this analysis, we did find that even predating or toward the middle end of 2019, we were starting to see an overall decline in reports. And when I talked with my analyst about this, so we were still seeing in the 400 range, high 400s range. But when I spoke to my analyst about this, we also talked about the fact that, you know, the pandemic is only the most recent crisis, that really we've been impacted by the PSPS and the fires. And so this analysis was very telling and made us want to do more to find out if kind of the fluctuation of reports can be tied to different occurrences in our communities. So really, the average is between 4 and 6, I would say, over the past few years, but a steady average of a regular year would be about 500 reports of abuse. So we've definitely seen marked fluctuation.
Got it. How about you, James? What's the legal assistance for seniors seeing in terms of cases that are people coming for assistance, or cases that you're filing this year as compared to last year?
Yeah, thank you, Judge. I think initially we were seeing a very similar trend of, in those initial months, the numbers were dropping off, but have since, experienced that uptick. So just for reference, I wasn't able to run quite as in-depth numbers as Vanessa, but, in 2019, which I think was fairly average, we opened 210 cases during this period. A quarter, I should say. So that's not per month. This would be for, or actually longer, March through September. And in this year, we opened upward of 200 and I want to say 40. So it's about a 10% increase. In terms of the types of cases we're seeing a lot of cases with people who are in enclosed living quarters together, really aren't able to get out into the community. So I think, like Vanessa was saying, we've seen an increase in physical abuse, but it's a lot of in-home abuse is what we're seeing. And we've also seen an uptick in COVID-related COVID-related finance scams, where people are calling and emailing and trying to reach out to older adults regarding, either made up benefits or some kind of benefit scheme. And so we've been trying to get a lot of information out to older adults through flyers, informational flyers, and through kind of more social media, but it's definitely been an increase.
And then Bridget, for the DA's office, do you have a sense of kind of cases that are being filed, arrests as this year as compared to previous years?
Yes, so I contacted several law enforcement agencies to try to get some stats. And of the ones that got back to me, there didn't really seem to be a significant difference from last year, post-COVID and since the shutdown. For example, Fremont had approximately 25 elder abuse reports in 2019 and before the shutdown, and 20 since the shutdown. Another very small agency said they had 1 before the shutdown and 1 after the shutdown. And probably the most significant was Hayward, and they had 34 reported cases before the shutdown and 11 since the shutdown. But I will note that they were reporting to me from a full year, March 2019 to March 2020. So it was a whole year versus 7 months. But still, that was the most significant difference that I found among the agencies as far as reported cases. But as far as charge cases, so our office decides which cases should be charged and what charges should be charged. And then after we decide that, the case goes in front of a judge, and the judge listens to some of the evidence. It's called a preliminary hearing, and the judge determines whether or not we've charged the right thing. And as far as the charge cases for our office, pre-shutdown, we had 47 defendants charged with elder and dependent adult abuse cases, and post the shutdown, we had 44. So I don't think it was a particularly statistical difference. But what we have noticed recently, my colleagues and I have noticed that, just like Jim said, I think there's a little bit of an uptick in the financial elder abuse reporting and charging. And in talking to my colleagues, we fully expect that there will be more financial abuse reporting in the upcoming months, as well as real estate, which is financial, but very specifically real estate fraud.
And do you have any anecdotal sense that as Santa Rita has released people more quickly because of concerns about COVID exposure in Santa Rita and making those decisions about overcrowding, has that affected at all people who are arrested for particularly physical assault and elder abuse cases being released more quickly than they otherwise might be?
Yes, I definitely think that they are being released more quickly than they were before the shutdown, for sure. We are seeing many cases where we are asking for people to be kept in custody because, and we only ask when we really believe based upon their record or usually the current, actually the current offense to which they are charged. If that current offense is one of violence, we tend to ask for them to stay in custody, especially if it's extreme violence. But we are finding because of COVID-19, they aren't getting, our requests are denied more frequently.
And then Nicole, in terms of the referrals you're seeing, particularly as shelter-in-place rules and other kind of state guidelines are particularly affecting nursing home and other types of supportive care, have you seen a change in referrals and requests for assistance?
Absolutely. As you said, your last normal day was March 16th. And right at that same time, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as multiple other agencies, restricted access to long-term care. So we went from an environment where there was plentiful oversight to within 24 hours, there was really not many people in buildings besides residents and staff, including family and other mandated reporters. So like Vanessa, we received complaints that what are called in California, SOC 341s. We received complaints of abuse, that those really dried up. And across the state, in terms of ombudsman, we went from about a 60% reduction in complaints related to elder abuse in just a few months. You know, say in January, resolving, over 500 abuse cases, and then in August, resolving less than 300. And so we did see a dramatic reduction, and I think that's why there's been so much concern about what's going on in skilled nursing facilities and other long-term care settings, is because we know not only is COVID, really such a huge risk, but we also know that individuals left in isolation, particularly those who may experience the effects of dementia and other impairments, are really at risk for all kinds of abuse. And unfortunately, because family and friends can't see what's going on, there is a deep concern about what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know right now. And so as ombudsmen have resumed their normal work habits, we're really uncovering what has gone on in the last 7 months.
Thank you. And so just to add what we're seeing in Alameda County, so I've ran the number of cases of elder abuse petitions that are filed. And so just to note that unlike everyone else who's on this panel, for an elder abuse restraining order, it's the elder or the representative who has to take the initiative and decide I want a restraining order, unlike a DA who's bringing charges or someone else advocating for them. So for the 5-month period that was at the beginning of 2020, 2019, the average number of cases brought or petitions filed per month was about 23. And so when you look at the relevant, similar comparable period of time in 2020, that dropped from 23 per month down to about 17.8. And so we're just talking, of course, about the number of cases of people filing. And there are lots of barriers in particular for people filing, particularly for elderly, in terms of our courts largely being closed, in terms of our self-help centers being virtual, in terms of the ability to attend a hearing being virtual. So there are lots of barriers that are arising as a result of the pandemic that's affecting that. And then anecdotally, I review all temporary restraining orders that are filed, whether they're domestic violence or gun violence restraining orders or elder abuse in all of Alameda County, and I rule on them. And so what I've been noticing anecdotally is, in many ways, this is a perfect storm because we have the survivors and victims of elder abuse at home because of shelter-in-place rules, because of their own health concerns, but we often have their abusers also at home, oftentimes facing economic uncertainty because they've lost their jobs, their kids may be at home with them because of distance learning, and that really amps up the tension in the home. I've also been seeing anecdotally a lot of very directly COVID-related concerns. For example, family member who in violation of shelter in place is going out and being around other people and is not really following all of the shelter in place guidelines, and then coming home to an 85-year-old, 90-year-old, 65-year-old person who has underlying health concerns and very reasonably concerned about their own health and is having conversations about their loved one about the importance for them in terms of a life or death situation of making sure that these things are being obeyed and not being part of the abuse and part of the control and part of the isolation. So I think that we're seeing this kind of infect every layer of this dynamic in ways that are very concerning. So let me turn to the second question. And for this, let me start with James. What are some of the obstacles that you are facing in getting services to victims of elder dependent adult abuse at this time?
Yeah, thank you, Judge. And just to follow up, I think on the last point, I mean, I think as we know, and it's probably worth restating, you know, depending on what metric you're looking at, 1 in 6, 1 in 10, 1 in 12 cases of elder abuse gets reported during, you know, non-COVID times. And so I think like Vanessa was, and Nicole and you, Judge, were saying, I'd be really curious to see, I suspect that the real numbers are rising and going way, way up, but it may take some time to really know and to see the impact of that. In terms of obstacles, I think, you know, the first obstacle was really information. Actually, you know, there was a lot of having to pivot and understanding, especially in March and April, how to let the public know that services were still available, that the courts were still open, that they could file a restraining order, that there were still opportunities to exercise their rights and protect themselves was really a big challenge, especially for populations that are isolated, underserved, you know, are hard to reach in general. And, you know, just for our team, you know, another barrier that is continuing is that these cases on the civil side and doing this type of legal work just takes longer now. Getting signatures, driving around, getting the signatures, finding the witnesses, gathering the evidence, prepping the client, making sure they have the technology to attend the hearing and can meaningfully participate, have all been really big challenges, you know, we've had to try to address. And, you know, I think there are so many older adults in need who don't have access to computers, telephones, you know, these type of webinar services. And without service providers really stepping in and creating that bridge, they're really effectively going to be shut out from the system. And then in particular, through you know, no one's fault, I think having to attend court virtually for you know, everyone is really difficult, and I think is normally a very difficult process. It's emotionally very stressful. It can be very difficult for our older adults to participate, and then making it a virtual platform, while I think it is absolutely the best that we can do for a lot of our clients, is extremely difficult for them to have meaningful interaction in that process. And takes a lot of work to really make sure that they're able to engage and participate.
Let me just kind of chime in my perspective from the court, which is I can imagine that this is incredibly challenging for all of you, particularly even more so for your litigants. As I said before, like the clients that you all help are coming in when under the best of times, being involved with any of you would have been the most traumatic, destabilizing, awful time in their life. And now to layer on this. And for the court's perspective, from lots of different times, I mean, I've used this metaphor so many times, I'm sick of it, but we were literally building the plane in midair of what are our regulations? Are we going to use blue jeans? How are we going to do that? How are we going to get notice out to people? When the courts were completely closed for a long period of time, we were continuing matters because we simply had no hearings. And so particularly for someone who's been dealing with nothing but restraining orders for now the last 2.5 years, you have this real concern of, I've issued move-out orders, I've issued stay-away orders, and there have been no meaningful hearings, or I've denied that temporarily because I didn't have enough information, and I've, for at least some period of time not had any hearings. And then, of course, as you were saying, Jim, we have these virtual hearings, which is the best under the circumstances, but we're particularly mindful that we have people with audio and visual limitations in terms of being able to hear or having the right connection or making sure, how am I going to get my evidence to the court? And so we are, and to say nothing of when you have a language access issue, whether you need ASL, you need Spanish, or you need Mandarin, and to be able to advocate for yourself, it's a very challenging time for us to kind of figure out how are we going to do. And I think part of the conversations, part of why it's so valuable to have conversations like this is we now know 6 or 7 months in that it may look like this, at least for the court, at least for the next 6 months to a year. And so it's helpful to take stock every once in a while to talk with one another about, now that we know, what are some best practices to carry forward? How about for you, Nicole, in terms of speaking with people you're assisting who are in nursing homes that may be closed down and may have health concerns? What are some of the challenges that you and your colleagues have faced in getting people services they need?
Yeah, I mean, I think we, like so many of you, turned our services on a dime. And as Jim said, we had to let the world know we were still doing our work, but it may not look like it did in the past. And I think that this is where I think we as service providers need to do a better job on the front end of ensuring that we can access our folks, whether I can be there in person or it's phone or it's technology, and helping people to be equipped with the tools that they need prior to a crisis occurring. And I think that's really, I sort of joke with people, I say the revolution is here. And what I mean is, like, the revolution of the way we deliver services really needs to be questioned and reviewed. And so we can talk about how is it that we work best, what services do our residents or clients in general really need versus what we think they need. And so as I look at who was impacted the most, COVID has disproportionately affected those who are in skilled nursing care. And I think part of the reason that is the way that we pay for long-term care in California, which is individuals who are Medi-Cal beneficiaries, Medi-Cal will only pay for skilled nursing care. So we took individuals who may or may not necessarily need that level of care, and it's really about, like, they need some assistance, they don't have the ability to live totally independently because it's very expensive to provide care in the home, and we put them a little bit in harm's way in the best of times, not realizing the worst of times would come. Whereas while COVID did definitely affect residential care facilities for the elderly, it was a less of an impact. When really the difference between those two settings is, can someone pay or can someone not pay? And I think that's where we see the disparate impacts is on people of color and individuals who maybe not have the same economic benefits that everyone else has, is they were really impacted, and they are, again, 7 months later, still really isolated. So I think now we're starting to see not just the effects of COVID and abuse, but the effects of isolation for a long period of time on someone who has physical or cognitive impairments. And so I think that the role of all of us, but I think especially Ombudsman, is what is the next phase for long-term care in this country, and what does really elder justice and elder equity look like?
And then Bridget, as you're kind of advocating for people on the criminal side, where you're trying to both speak to the witnesses, speak to people who are giving you critical evidence and prosecuting them, but also to keep them apprised about upcoming hearings and criminal protective orders and things like that, what challenges have you and your colleagues faced in this current kind of climate?
Well, I always say that we have to be flexible as prosecutors. It's very important that we understand, as soon as you become a prosecutor and you get involved in the criminal justice process, you quickly realize that things are going to happen. There's a lot of things there's a lot of moving parts, because we don't just get to work in a bubble by ourselves. We have to work with defense attorneys, there's court reporters, judges, clerks, witnesses, victims, defendants, and there's a lot of things that happen that make us have to switch gears or move sort of on the fly and make quick decisions, and hopefully thoughtful decisions. And so that was already a part of what we do every day. Now, these are unprecedented times, of course, for sure, But I think one of the things that was really great for the people that we serve is that a lot of the systems were already in place. For example, having the victim advocates that we have on staff already and having them, having one victim advocate assigned to every single elder case, whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor. Every DA's office doesn't do that, and ours does, because we've always believed that it's very important to start providing them those services that you talked about, getting them acclimated to the system, telling them what's coming up, what the court dates are. We discuss dispositions with them. We discuss what they are interested in. We also, of course, discuss other needs that they have besides just within our system, so that we can figure out how to best refer them. Probably the biggest change that I've seen, though, personally, is that in the past, we frequently did what's called conditional examinations for our elders, a lot of our elders, where we were able to record their testimony for trial closer to the time the case was initially charged. And so when the charges are filed, we would file a motion for this conditional exam, particularly for elders who are in ill health or who are extremely elderly. And that's so if by some tragedy they are no longer with us by the time it's time to go to trial, we can actually use their preserved recorded testimony in a trial. And I would say that's probably the biggest difference, is because our number one concern is not exposing our victims and witnesses to COVID. We're not bringing those witnesses in or those victims in for those conditional exams anymore. And instead, we are using other methods to capture their testimony. Or, like I said, for preliminary hearings, we have the officers testify under Penal Code Section 872B. They can testify on behalf of the victim. But we really are doing whatever we can to prevent our victims from being exposed to COVID by not having them come in. Our office set up the technology so that witnesses can come in and testify. We have computers in every witness waiting room in each of our offices. But I feel like with elderly victims, you really have to, and also some dependent care adults, some dependent adults, you really have to be careful, because a lot of them have pre-existing conditions and other things that make them more susceptible. And we don't want to create any more stress for them, or God forbid, to expose them to something that could definitely harm them. So we've changed our ways of doing things in the ways I've explained.
And then Vanessa, has APS done the same as you're doing your investigations and site visits? Are there barriers that you're having to navigate as you kind of conduct your investigations?
Absolutely, thank you. So going back to, I think Judge, you mentioned state guidance. Starting on March 17th, we immediately started receiving guidance from the state, and essentially the first guidance was cease all face-to-face visits with the exception of those that pose an immediate life risk. So physical assault, sexual assault. So we had to really pivot to an extensive telephonic process to conduct outreach to our clients. I commend workers. You know, this has been such a challenging time. And when I looked back in preparation for this panel, looking at how quickly everyone adapted and was really flexible, was really critical. And really our role as managers in terms of obstacles was looking at managing the safety of not only the community and our clients, but also our staff. And, you know, some of the staff that we employ could also be in high risk categories. So it was really balancing that and making sure that we were meeting their needs as well. In terms of APS specifically and the obstacles that we encountered, immediately there was a drop off in caregiver availability because of caregiver risk or caregiver just absence because of their own personal needs. Also the medical care, and Nicole touched on, you know, the disparity in access to care. Those who have pre-existing conditions and needed medical care suddenly were not able to receive that. And again, then not exposed to mandated reporters. So we weren't able to get as much information and interact with medical providers. We also saw a sudden increase in the crisis around food security and housing stability. And when APS workers are developing a service plan, they're looking at how to help someone be stable, to stop the abuse, but then create a safety net so that we don't then get another report. And so we've done a lot of work around just utilizing resources and accessing services for those emergency needs. We also, and this was touched on before, but financial abuse. And we noticed that our financial abuse reports or allegations overall were down by 37%. And really, we do suspect that this is because of the isolation. And the isolation is an obstacle when clients are not going to financial institutions or seeing their primary care physicians. We don't even have the information to reach out to them. So, you know, APS, again, I commend the workers. And I'll talk about this more later, but the skill set, you adjust your skill set. Like Bridget said, you find ways, you're very, you think outside the box. So learning how to build rapport over the phone. We've really tried to identify the obstacle and come up with an alternative plan that ultimately, and again, we'll talk about this later, some of these skills will probably be utilized forever in the work that we do.
Thank you. And then Nicole, just to continue on what Vanessa was saying and what you were saying earlier, how has inequity and lack of access to services affected elder dependent adults? Not only just kind of the social inequities of these particular clients, but the fact that a lot of the social service network that they were able to access before, whether they were public settings like senior centers or libraries that have been forced to close because of the shelter in place. And then as Vanessa was saying, of course, there's the food insecurity and all the other kind of benefits. And of course, local governments, county governments, state governments are becoming under increasing financial burden. And that of course is affecting all of our agencies and the court system. How is that coming together to particularly affect these populations?
Well, Judge, I'm so glad you said that, because as I was listening to Vanessa talk, I just was reflecting in that we all work for either nonprofits or government entities. And so we are quite judicious in how we spend money, and I could not simply run out down to the local Best Buy and buy 30 tablets and ensure Wi-Fi for all our clients. And, we just simply can't do that. We have to get permission and budget adjustments. And so much of this was about us, the way the systems we have set up and the people who depend on them, how maybe sometimes our well-intentioned systems maybe didn't allow as much flexibility as we could need in sort of crises like this situation. Excuse me. And so I think the equity issue, it affected people who needed services than most. If an older adult, and Bridget touched on this, being older is a wide spectrum. So some older adults were still able to go to the grocery store. We're still able to order their groceries, but that wasn't true of everyone. And so it's important that we talk about it. We realize that aging doesn't look like one thing. And we recognize that older adults have the right to self-determination. I get to be an express wish advocate, so I don't get to tell someone what they should do. I have to listen to what they want to do. But around equity, I think the way it happened is folks who depend on the community and their local close by community for connection, for engagement, also frankly for really neighborly oversight. That's what was taken away from them. Those individuals that could jump on the Wi-Fi and see their children or friends and family, or already knew how to get from point A to point B without assistance, those folks retain those resources. It's the individuals who were depending on a patchwork of services of transportation and legal assistance and the coordinator at the senior center to keep an eye on them and make sure that they really kept the precarious balance between health and autonomy in line that were affected. I think that's why we saw in Alameda County, there was a dramatic turn to get food out to individuals, to implement the Great Plates program, to continue to ensure that there was a connection of services. And I think all of us would acknowledge, I think we did a pretty good job. And we also know that something like this will happen again, and we need to have more plans in place at the outset. And so that's why I continue to think of equity isn't just an issue that affects the individuals we serve, it's an issue that affects the organizations that we run. And so I think as we go forward, I think we're all going to talk about how do we build equitable workplaces that can turn on a dime and be responsible to individuals' needs and their health and safety as well. So I think it's a complicated mix, but what I hope for the future we begin to do is allowing programs freedom to plan, forgive the expression, but outside the box. to think of what does the worst case scenario look like, what does the best case scenario look like, and plan within that, and hopefully eliminate some of the challenges around contracting and spending. Certainly not spending, willy-nilly, but really just being cognizant of how can our programs come together, and also the real connection of services, that if I have a client, likely that's a client of Jim's at some point, and maybe Vanessa down the way. And so how can we really build those networks to make sure that no one falls through the cracks?
And I think it's also worth noting that there are equitable issues that have existed in our county and the surrounding Bay Area counties long before COVID and will exist long after COVID, but they're really exacerbating the situation. The primary one that springs to mind certainly is housing. Is that in housing, that if you in a restraining order issue someone a move-out order, you are functionally in Alameda County making them homeless because there's simply nowhere else to go. When you layer on top of that a pandemic that makes our elderly a particularly vulnerable population, and you also talk about distance learning, where for a lot of our families, the elderly, the grandparents are often the additional childcare. They're the people who stay home when the kids are sick. Well, now if your kids are home all of the time, or if you're all living together in multi-generational households, you have a very significant problem, because now it means that there really is no ability to do anything other than live together in a way that brings our populations into particular kind of stark relief in terms of their health threat. And you layer on top of that a public transportation system that for so many of our elderly, they heavily relied on to get to all of your agencies, certainly to come to the Hayward Hall of Justice. Lots of our elderly populations would take BART, or they take a shuttle, or they take the bus. And of course, now they roll the dice on that poses a very significant health risk for them. And so I think these kind of broader socioeconomic equity issues that really face our whole county is something that is particularly affecting our populations in this time of pandemic. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions and answers. So I'm going to go to our next question. Bridget, what workplace innovations and practices did the DA's office create to continue serving the populations during this shelter in place?
Well, I don't know if we necessarily had to create a lot of new innovations. I think our transition into the shutdown was fairly smooth from our standpoint. One of the things that we did that I think obviously has changed for sure is that the investigator, the victim advocate, and the DA assigned to the case has always gone to meet the dependent adult or elder where they are. So if they are in a home or facility, we usually go to them and we don't make them come to us, especially as we are just meeting them and establishing that relationship. And now, because we do not want to expose them to COVID, we still meet them, but we have to do that, kind of like Vanessa said, we have to establish that rapport all over the phone. So as soon as a case is assigned to the DA and the victim advocate, we call the victims right away and we start talking to them, explaining what their case is about, what has been charged. We answer all their questions about the charging. We continue to call them and tell them what the next court dates are. We ask them what they are interested in because, and happening and seeing happen to the case, even though as prosecutors, we decide any plea bargains or anything, a lot of the outcomes are either predetermined by the statute or we decide what we are going to agree with the defense attorneys. Our office believes that it's very important to listen to the victim and pay attention to what they are interested in, especially because many of the defendants are family members. So they might be in the best position, the elder or dependent adult might be in the best position to really know what's going to be best for them or their family. And we really want to, in many cases, and are able to continue to foster the relationships or continue to keep intact the relationships that they have with those family members while keeping the victim safe at the same time by doing things like working with the defense attorneys to just have the defendant move to a different location, move out of the home, or to relocate the victim, work with APS or have our victim advocates work with APS to relocate a victim. Or work with LAS and have a restraining order put in place. We're able to, and also criminal restraining orders as well, criminal protective orders. Through lots of different means, we're able to try to work together with the victim to do what we think is best for them.
And then, James, how about the legal assistance for seniors? Obviously, Ms. Burba, Ms. Doyle are able attorneys, but now they're facing a very different challenge because you're having to get declarations prepared. You're having to meet with your client in advance and consult with them and prepare them for the hearing. And obviously, as an attorney, you want to be next to your client during the hearing so you can be able to talk to them and ask them questions if there's a question during the hearing. And now we're all appearing virtually. Are there new protocols or best practices that your agency has kind of had to adopt as you're also on the fly trying to adapt to this new normal?
Yeah, and I think this really goes to Nicole's point of, I think our learning lesson is everything we do because of working with older adults, because of all the things we've talked about, we're really a face-to-face agency, like all of the agencies here today. We're in person, we're in the home, we're at the senior center. That is such a huge part of the mix of the services that we give and we really value in creating that bond and that relationship. And so any event that we have that kind of is going to disrupt the normal, whether it's a pandemic or a natural disaster or whatever the next thing is, I think what's come to our really the front of our attention is that need for connectivity and what does that look like in times when things get challenging, even well beyond the pandemic. And so we have really focused on digital connectivity in terms of reaching out to funders and partners, in terms of getting iPads for hearings, in terms of making sure the attorneys are set up mobily at home so they could print out a declaration, get it signed, and get it to court. And so kind of like Nicole was saying, really looking forward in terms of best practices, that really doubling down and making sure that we're taking advantage of all the ways that we connect with older adults, regardless of whether language is an issue, regardless of whether their physical mobility is an issue, regardless of whether transportation is an issue. Our goal at the end of the day is that none of those are going to prohibit an older adult from getting the services that they need. And really, for us, the first line of answer is coming down to making sure we have all of the trinkets and gadgets and any tools at our disposal, that we have those available and on the ready, like Nicole said. So the next time we pivot, we can do it that much quicker.
Great. So for the next question, Vanessa, given your experience working with this population, what do you anticipate being some of the long-lasting effects and impacts on this population, particularly the high level of stress that they're dealing with in terms of the pandemic, the social isolation that we're all dealing with, but that may be affecting them in particular, the difficulties that they're facing in having someone reach out to them because that itself poses its own health risks? Do you have a sense of, and the uncertainty about when this might all return to what we would describe as normal? Do you have a sense of what might be some of the mid to long-term impacts that we would expect to continue to see?
Excellent question, Judge. Absolutely. We're definitely concerned about the end of the eviction moratorium. I think we're all anticipating a lot of consequences, a potential spike in homelessness, and certainly I think we'll all have to rally around the populations that we serve when that emerges. Some of the wonderful innovative programs like Project Room Key and Great Plates, and they're great, but we also, those of us who know we'll be working in this field beyond that, there's a concern, at least for our agency, of what will happen beyond those programs and what can we look at short and long term to fill the gaps left if some of those programs end. In terms of mental health, I think the isolation, the physical abuse, what our clients are encountering and experiencing, there may be an increase in depression or trauma that I don't know that we know what that will look like, but certainly we can anticipate that. Quite frankly, just to say this, the death of our clients, the death of caregivers, we have seen that across the board, and it's just been so traumatic to our workforce, to our families, to the multi-generational homes that their loved ones are dying. That's just such an impact that we don't know how that will look for all of us years to come, but we would certainly expect it to be impactful. And then of course, we have to be realistic about the employment situation and how the financial strain and devastation that so many families are experiencing how that will affect us long term. So I would anticipate a consistent rise in financial abuse cases. And I think James mentioned the new scams related to COVID. You always see these scammers become more sophisticated. I would anticipate a whole new crop of scams emerging. And then, just dealing with all of those long-lasting effects of our agency and all of our agencies having an increased role around food security, housing security, managing the criminal justice element. So I think we all just need to be prepared, and there's a lot. So hopefully that's
very helpful. And I think the eviction, tying back to the housing, is one area where it is a looming Damocles sword in terms of all these people with housing insecurity, and maybe that right now they're not paying apartment rent, but they know that at some point they may have to pay all the back rent and they may be kicked out of their apartments. And of course, the flip side of it is, although certainly I wouldn't describe it as a silver lining, is that we see lots of cases filed in civil harassment cases, in elder abuse cases, and domestic violence cases that really are eviction cases. That these people should not be together, maybe doesn't necessarily rise to the level of abuse. But without our eviction courts, the parties don't really have an alternative other than trying to realize this is not a sustainable situation. And even if it is not yet abuse, this is certainly going to turn to abuse in the very near future if we don't figure out the situation. And so a lot of these problems we have kind of somewhat kicked down the road, and at some point there's going to be a price to pay, and that's going to be very significant. So Nicole, let me ask you, what are some of the lessons that we've learned and best practices that we've developed during this time that might be beneficial, that if the current normal, new normal for the next 6 months to a year, what are some things that your agency has learned that might affect, knowing what you know now, how you would approach the next 12 months?
Never to take for granted the fact that you can leave your home and move about freely. I think that's the first lesson. But something that Jim was touching on around like getting everyone to sign documents, which I think pertains to us as contractors and also our clients, is moving away from a required physical presence. That if something requires a signature, other ways to authenticate whom they are and make sure that they are authorized to sign on someone's behalf. Moving towards the idea that we don't have to physically see something for ourselves to know that it's true, that we can simply see images, trust someone, that there's other ways to go about that. But what I would also say from a long-term care ombudsman perspective and from an oversight perspective, I think we should have been worrying about re-entry into facilities long before we were. You know, when we were sort of locked out on March 16th, I think right away, Department of Public Health and Community Care Licensing and Ombudsman Services should have been planning for a return. And I think, unfortunately, that was a little bit later than I think what many of us would have wanted in late August for California. That we should have been planning for how is it that we can enter facilities and operate safely and still ensure execution of services while not just abandoning our responsibilities. And so I think that's an area where I would say as an ombudsman, I wish we would have spent more time earlier on. I think also recognizing the relation to trauma and how that will have its long impacts on both all of us and our staff. That's an important thing to note as employers, but also the people that we've served. This will likely be something that they will refer to for many years. And so I hope that we take from this also some increased mental health services for older adults. It is very difficult to come by a therapist who is skilled in working with someone who is older, who also may be experiencing some cognitive impairment and is experiencing any kind of mental issues as well as mental illness. And so I think that's the thing is I want to look towards is planning our services for the senior of the future, not what we had conceived of them in the past. That I think sometimes we assumed, oh, seniors don't want technology, and I don't think that's the case. They only want services in a certain way. Well, that may be true, but it can be a hybrid. I also think we can look towards the future as we think of things like senior centers. There may always still be a physical presence, but there also can be simultaneous online offerings. And I think that's really going to serve us well in the future because the older adults that are in their 60s today are some of the most technologically savvy folks we've ever seen on the planet. And as they age, they're going to take that with them.
Great, thank you. And I think this is a really important question. So let me turn to Bridget and ask the same question, which is, if you could take all of the information that you and your colleagues have now and transport yourself back to March 16th, kind of how would you have approached it differently, or how are you going to approach the next 6 to 12 months differently, knowing what you know now, if this is continuing to be the new normal?
Well, one thing that is, I think was a surprise to me is that many of our victims most of our victims are still willing to work with us and are still very cooperative with us. And I really think that has to do with the fact that, like I said earlier, the district attorney's office really did have protocols and procedures in place that really address the needs of victims, elderly and dependent adult victims, before the shutdown. So a lot of what we did before, we're able to do now. Really, the biggest difference is just we're doing it remotely as opposed to in person. But a lot of the things that were still in place, that were in place before, are still in place, just with a slight variance. The thing that we have to keep in mind as prosecutors is that it might be a very long time before our victims, our elderly victims particularly, and more vulnerable victims, are really comfortable coming back to court. And so we can't assume that the day there's a vaccine, that the next morning we can start making all these elderly victims come to court. And as long as we are always flexible and always thoughtful and empathetic in the way that we deal with our victims and listen to them, I think we will continue to have that great partnership that allows them to continue to want to work with us and to cooperate with us in the way that they always have.
Thank you. And then Vanessa, how about APS? Knowing what you know now, are there systematic thoughts and conversations about how to approach the foreseeable future? Because as Bridget says, and I think that's true, the court feels the same way, which is, even if there's a vaccine, I mean, there are some of my colleagues that feel like this may look like how we are providing justice in restraining orders for the next 2 to 3 years. Because frankly, if you just think about the architecture of the Hayward Hall of Justice, of having people from not only all around the county, but through all around the 7 Bay Area counties coming into a small environment and sitting together, whether it's in a hallway, or even if you were to call them in one person at a time, that realistically is not anything that we're going to want to do and run the risk that we're going to be a vector of disease spread. So if this is what it's like, does APS have thoughts about how it may change or incorporate some of what it's been doing on the fly as a long-term procedure?
Definitely. We've received additional guidance, or we did in June, from the state that instead of, and I speak about the shift, we were doing phone screening with the purpose of not meeting with individuals back in March. And the shift is now we are doing phone screening on non-emergency cases with the goal of then conducting a scheduled face-to-face visit. So I think that certainly some of the adjustments and the best practices are, again, our phone screening process the skills have just, skyrocketed, and our ability to build rapport and work telephonically in a way where clients aren't concerned that we're potentially perpetrating them over the phone, which is a very real concern when you can't see someone. Then with the goal of actually conducting a face-to-face visit, which gives our clients empowerment and control, so it gives them more authority around our ability to interact with them, is a practice that will be going on indefinitely. And it also allows our workers to continue to develop that skill, that investigatory skill, without needing to put themselves or clients at risks. We, in our APS program, we also have the added benefit of working with public health nurses who are embedded in our program. This has really highlighted how, again, our types of partnerships and those partnerships are so critical, because having different lenses, the social work, investigatory, and then that public health lens, allow for an approach that is, it provides a wraparound type of service. So more of that, just recognizing the importance of that. And then also, Judge, I think you mentioned transportation. We really need to be able to recognize what those services are that we need in a pinch, that maybe we take for granted during non-emergency times, that suddenly will become incredibly challenging to access. And we need to have that toolkit to be able to launch those services so quickly. So we're working on developing that and having safety supplies on hand and having those toolkits readily available, so that we can practice this way for a long period of time and possibly incorporate some of those things we've learned long term.
Great, thank you. And then last, Jim, let me ask you, how do we ensure going forward that we provide equitable and holistic services? Because I think that at the very beginning, we were talking about the importance for all of our clients that we're not letting people fall off in between the cracks in those lines that was on the document in the beginning. That becomes all the more challenging when we're all at home, when we're providing our services from our own office, where our clients are at their own home and we're having FaceTime conversations with them in Skype and Zoom and everything else. It's all the more difficult to ensure that we are physically handing them off. So how do we going forward make sure that we're providing to those people who need it equitable services, but also ones that are holistic for the whole nature of challenges that people are facing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And like so much of the conversation that we were having, you know, I think this was a huge issue pre-COVID. And COVID has only really served to highlight and to shine a light on really the real need around equitable services and making sure that this delivery is happening in a way that gets to those who need it most. I mean, I think one of the big ways is having forums like this and not letting this conversation stop. I mean, that's why I think all of us were so excited to have this platform, to have this discussion, because I think it's, you know, it's so easy. We were talking statistics beforehand, and I've already seen papers around, you know, abuse with children during this time and abuse with different populations, and we're getting there. But once again, older adults seem to kind of be lagging behind in terms of this focus. And so as much as possible with our community, with our legislature, with our community partners, that bringing this conversation to the forefront and not letting it drop. Because I think when a lot of people, you know, this is already a kind of a population that's underserved and under talked about and underrepresented, and we always talk about that in good times. And I think that has only been compounded by the fact that there's a lot of suffering out there right now, but that doesn't mean that older adults can go to the wayside. And so I think as advocates and champions of older adults, and I'll say as someone who hopes to get there someday, and you know, we're all greedily working towards the society we want to age into. And I think connecting that to the general public and really not letting this conversation stop is one of the best tools that we have. I mean, I know it sounds a little bit pie in the sky, but I think bringing it to people's attention and keeping it at the forefront that, you know, we have older adults in Alameda County, and these groups have done amazing work over this pandemic. It really have. I mean, Vanessa's group, Nicole, but everybody has been so collaborative, so flexible. Everyone is trying their hardest, but we still have 73-year-olds who are hitting the streets, and we have to just decide that, you know, we have to bring that to people's attention, because I don't know of anybody who, if I brought that to their attention and took a poll, that they're okay with that. And so it's just so important that we continue to keep this conversation, especially as things get, you know, back to quote unquote normal and there's a vaccine. I think it's going to be really easy for this conversation to stop and for folks to move on from older adults. And the waves from this pandemic, I think, are going to last longer. They've hit harder for older adults. They're going to last longer. And we need to just keep calling attention to that and making sure we're doubling down on our efforts.
Thank you so much. So I want to take some questions that are coming in from the chat and the Q&A. The first one, I think I'm going to direct towards Vanessa, but if anyone else has a relevant answer to it. Is there trouble getting needed older adult placements in long-term care facilities or facilities, given the kind of current shelter-in-place restrictions on nursing homes and everything else that's going along? And maybe Nicole, you might have something else about this as well.
Yes, absolutely. Movement in general between placements, any type of placement, there are multiple factors. I will say that, you know, the financial challenges, those you know, predate COVID, but those remain. An added piece, of course, the risk, transportation, inability, just very, you know, logistically looking at how to move someone. And then there's an added element of when someone is moving into a new placement, there's a whole medical workup that's required, a TB test, a physical, and now there's a COVID screening. that's required. And certainly, I think there's some improvement in that, but I know everyone initially, no one knew how to get that done or what that looked like. That was just a very real, challenging problem. And at this point, even if individuals are in situations that are not ideal, as you know, Bridget mentioned earlier, individuals are being released from the jail setting. You know, it's kind of the lesser of two evils. Where is there less risk of COVID? And when is the abuse or the type of abuse something that can be mitigated in that current setting? So yeah, there are a lot of factors that are coming into play in terms of movement to different levels of care, certainly.
And then Nicole, I didn't know if you want to add anything.
Absolutely. I think that finding clients in general care opportunities to make sure their needs are met is always challenging. It's especially challenging right now, and especially for, another audience we don't have is, public guardian, public authorities. They have conservatees in facilities that they haven't been able to lay eyes on in 6 months, yet they're responsible for making financial and healthcare decisions for. So I think it's very challenging when you're looking at like, gosh, a family has reached their end, some person needs to be in a congregate living setting, that you can't necessarily go and tour as you normally would. You can't see it in multiple instances, and you don't get to build the relationship with the caregivers that you normally would. And so I think that, additionally, early on in the pandemic it was unclear when individuals were being transferred from an acute care setting to a skilled nursing setting, what that process would look like, and what was the requirement for skilled nursing facilities to bring them back into the facility. And so I think that gets back to the earlier point of, we need to have more contingency plans that are communicated more widely to a bigger group of people than what we originally thought.
Thank you. And then Nicole, earlier you were talking about some systemic change that we really should be seeing in terms of how we provide medical care, how we provide housing. And I'm just wondering if any of you are aware of legislative efforts now that we kind of have laid bare a lot of these more significant problems that the pandemic has created, whether you're aware of any legislative efforts to either look at additional financial abuse that may be unique to kind of this COVID pandemic time, or how we're providing long-term care or other types of housing, or anything else you'd like to see along those lines.
I think the biggest push that we've seen is in, it's not directly related to elder abuse, but I know it's come up several times, is housing. The temporary reliefs that are in place are going to be up, towards the start of 2021. And there's just a lot of questions on what the logistics, what it looks like after that. And so I know, one of the big focuses that in our agency is really trying to work with legislators, talk to folks in the Capitol, and really start, both in the county and at the state level and the city level, to really understand and plan for if we don't come up with a comprehensive set of solutions around the housing needs, soon, that we are going to have another full-blown crisis on our hands fairly soon.
Thank you. And then, Nicole, I am interested, because you have this perspective of multiple counties, and I'm sure a number of you, particularly legal assistants for seniors, may see things in other counties, but you are literally ombudsmen for Contra Costa, Solano, and Alameda. And so I'm just interested if you have a comparative approach in terms of looking at how the various counties are approaching some of these issues, whether it's court availability and the ability to go to hearings, or whether it means, some of these support services. I'm just interested in your perspective with regard to that.
Yeah, the Bay Area is an interesting place in that even within certain counties, it's important to realize that different cities have very different culture. Vallejo within Solano County is very different than Dixon, also in the same county. And so you really have kind of like microcosms of what's going on. But I actually would change the premise of the question, is that when we think of things like county services, I think sometimes in the Bay Area, that logic is not serving us well, in that many of us live in one county, work in another, our kids go to school in another, our parents live in yet a different county, all within a few miles of each other. And so I think what we've seen is that because of our various county structures, we all responded very differently. And what I think the takeaway is that I hope, again, that we are talking to each other more. And I think sometimes we're just humans and we don't always want to share the hard stuff, right? Because it's hard to say like, hey, we could have done that better. Maybe that wasn't our best, at bat. And I think that what we need to say is, here's where we're doing really well. Here's where another county might be doing a little bit better than us, and a willingness to share information. And the bigger thing, share resources. Because I think what we see is across city lines, it could be just across the street or across county lines, is we see that continued disparate treatment based on economics. What I've seen that Alameda County did really well is that they created some response in long-term care settings that included education. Right now, we're getting ready to launch an initiative to provide pulse oximeters to all of the residential care facilities for the elderly. But I think we're a big county and it sometimes takes time to move. And so it would be good to look at things in maybe more of a micro setting.
That's really helpful. And I think to underscore your point, all of the counties are motivated to do their best and to serve these populations. No one's trying to shirk their obligations. But frankly, the nature of the COVID pandemic is that different counties are facing different health crises of different levels. Our testing is different. Our number of cases per 100,000 residents is different. And as a result, we're trying to emphasize and prioritize different things. And as I said before, we're trying to do it on the fly. So the way that Contra Costa may have decided to deal with the restraining orders at the outset versus Alameda County versus Santa Clara County, or the way that we may be doing hearings now, I know there are some counties that feel very importantly, we need to have in-person hearings for restraining orders because we need to have people in front of us. We can assess credibility. Other counties feel like we don't want to run the risk of having this spread and have us be the vector. And so we're going to have virtual hearings. And I don't know that anyone can reasonably say there is a right answer other than to say, as Nicole is saying, we need to have these conversations. We need to talk about what works for the counties and where different counties have decided to go a different approach. We need to talk about what are best, if that's what you're going to do, what are the best practices to do it that way? And what can we learn from other counties if we're going to do it that way? So I think that that's a really critical point. Another question, Jim, for you is in kind of balancing the costs and benefits of technology, meaning, for example, just to kind of extrapolate off the question, for people who need therapy, now we have the ability to do virtual therapy without leaving your home, that you can talk to your therapist for an hour every week if you want to and never have to leave your home and run that risk. But also to know that that same technology is going to be the only way you're going to see your family, or it's the only way you're going to attend a virtual hearing. And with our population, they have the unique challenge of they may have, a difficulty hearing, or they may have difficulty seeing, and the only screen that they have is an iPad or a phone to participate in these hearings. Can you talk a little bit more about the role and benefit and challenge that technology faces in addressing this particular population and its issues?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, it's still a question of, even if we have, let's say, iPads available for hearing, that still needs to get to the older adult where they are. They still need to be trained on how to use it. It still needs to be a safe space that they can attend the hearing and not put themselves at risk that they're, testifying against somebody who's currently in their home. And so it is a tricky balance. And I think I'm thinking about it in the way that Nicole was kind of framing the county conversation, is that we're learning a ton of lessons about this as we're moving through. And so having that flexibility, what comes to mind, a case we're particularly proud of is, a client who needed needed ASL to attend a hearing and was really effectively not going to be able to attend the hearing. And so what that really took was, although this means our numbers go down, it meant spending those hours getting the equipment to the client, making sure that the interpreter had the equipment, doing a test run, which, we normally might not do. And so doing dry runs to make sure that the client then could use it and felt comfortable. And, by the time we got to the hearing, we had probably spent an extra maybe 10 hours getting the client to that point. But to us, I mean, that was the only way that client was going to have access to the courts, access to, to exercise the client's rights. But that being said, it's still not perfect. I mean, I think there are a lot of folks, I'm younger, but I struggle with technology. I'm a slow learner when it comes to tech things. And so I think for a lot of folks, even the availability, doesn't really get them there. Do they have the internet access? And so taking the cases one at a time and really spending that time to make sure that, whatever that magic mix is what we're going to do. And frankly, what that's meant for LAS is that in the coming year, we're probably going to help less people, to be honest. I mean, that's just the reality, but I would rather spend the time with the clients we do have and invest that time to make sure that they're right, that we're getting them there with whatever necessary mix of tech and travel and all of those things, then try to help more folks and not quite do a good job a bigger number.
Thank you. I mean, just to add on to that, to steal a phrase from Nicole earlier, there's a lot that we didn't know until we started practicing. Like my Alameda County Family Court colleagues and I were doing dry run blue jean hearings about 3 weeks before we started. And I'm the chair of a statewide language access subcommittee, so that's something of particular importance to me. So I realized that the first time for language access, that when we had 2 Spanish speakers, it actually worked out fine. I had 1 Spanish interpreter. It took a little time. We were doing consecutive interpretation. I spoke in English, the interpreter spoke in Spanish, they answered. But where it went off the rails is when I had 1 litigant who spoke English, 1 litigant who spoke Spanish, and every time I would ask the English litigant person, even though I told him, you gotta wait for the interpreter to finish translating, he would start answering me because on his screen, all he could see was my face looking at him, asking him a question in a language that he understood. And the interpreter was trying to speak Spanish and he was trying to speak English, and it was just craziness. And I think that's just another notion of how technology and equal access to justice and language access and access for some of our population that needs other types of support is a really challenging thing in a virtual world. So for all of its benefits, and there are benefits for all of our elder litigants who can appear at a hearing from home. They don't have to figure out how do they get to the Hayward Hall of Justice by 10 a.m. There are certainly lots of challenges that we still have to navigate going forward. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I do want to ask one last question that kind of echoes something that Nicole asked earlier, which is, how are you and your colleagues currently doing? Because just to underscore what Jim is saying, there is more need for our services certainly with less resources, and in some instances less staff, because staff may have health-related concerns. That means that they're out on leave. And this is going to be a long race that is going to be going on for the next 6 months, 12 months. And so it's not going to help any of the people we're trying to help if we and our colleagues and our staff are burning out because we're just trying to be everything to everyone. And Vanessa, maybe let me start with you, because often you're the front lines of a lot of the investigation, what's going on. I'm interested to hear how you and your staff are doing in navigating this current situation.
I would say we are actually doing quite well now. I'll give kudos to Alameda leadership. The benefits for the employees have been just fantastic, and our staff are so committed that they want to provide services, but they're also appropriately very outspoken. So there's so much flexibility, so much support, and really we're all practicing kindness and patience with one another, and then engagement up and down the chain. So we've really just allowed for a lot more safe space for all of us to work through this. And because of that, we're doing well. We're able to pull through, and then we'll have to revisit this in about 6 months to a year to see when the calm potentially begins. Thank you for asking.
Yeah. How about you, Jim? In terms of, like you said, the demand and the need is desperate and it's ever growing. And LAS is, as I remember from my earlier jobs, is a staff that is not so big as to deal with all this demand under the normal circumstances. How is everyone holding up?
Yeah, again, I appreciate the question. My staff are amazing. People come to work, I'm sure at all of our agencies. Nobody comes to LAS other than for reasons that they are just so passionate about the work, but there's a danger there. And so I think really starting to have conversations around, like you said, Judge, we're a limited size staff, and this is a long haul, and we need to pace ourselves. We're used to saying yes. We're used to going the extra mile. They're used to that. And for them, putting the governor on the services they provide is new for them, and they don't like it. But I think the hope, is long term that really allows us to all get through to have that kind of patience and flexibility and openness that Vanessa was talking about. But I was already so impressed, and I'm so fortunate that I have such amazing staff, and it's only been totally confirmed during COVID.
That's great. And Bridget, how are the DAs in that unit holding up?
I think one of the reasons that we are holding up quite well is because of collaboration. I think collaboration is key for resiliency and longevity in this particular assignment. And I mean collaboration within our agency, as far as the DAs working in conjunction with the investigators and the advocates, but also collaboration with the other wonderful agencies that you see here and other agencies throughout the state. Having someone else to lean on and knowing that you have their back and they have your back, and we are all, especially within our organization, we all have the same goals of protecting the victims, making sure that they are heard, making sure they are listened to, and that they really know and feel that they're part of this process and not left behind or left out. I think as long as we all keep those goals in mind and are striving towards those goals, we're going to continue to be fine.
Thank you. And then last but not least, Nicole, how's the Ombudsman office holding up?
Yeah, so we have a set of core values, and one of them is urgency over crisis. And so we try to live that out. And I think it was remembering the point of, like, when Jim was saying is we want to say yes to everything, that we have to prioritize what is urgent, but realize like we cannot be in crisis with the people that we are working for. Otherwise, they won't get the services they need. I think it's also okay to acknowledge, like, I reached out to Jim a lot during when it was really bad and was like, hey, I need to talk, or I'm stressed out, or how are you dealing with this? And I think to hear from other people that you weren't alone in that. And I think it's important to remember that no one's at their best right now. So if you're feeling a little more brusque than you would, if you're feeling a little more stressed, or someone comes back at you just in the wrong way, no one's at their best, and let's just give a lot of grace. So I think as a whole, we've had to make space for staff of, like, gosh, having our intake desk plexiglassed in feels a little scary, right? It doesn't mean that it's scared off. It means that we're understanding that fear and then why we're doing it. So I think that those have been the critical pieces. And again, that Alameda County is a great place to live and work, and we're doing our best to keep everyone safe.
Thank you so much. And just to echo that, I think that I haven't seen any of my colleagues since March 16th. And I think this can be a very isolating enterprise. So it's wonderful to see you all and to see the 100+ people who took time out of their day to come hear about this, and to remember that you're part of a community for whom protecting elder and dependent adults is critically important, that they want to learn more, that you're part of a community and network that is all working together to meet those same kind of goals. And I think that always helps regenerate that sense of purpose, that you're not isolated, however small your agency is, however small it feels, doing your work from your basement where I am or anywhere else, that you're a part of a larger network. So with that, I want to thank you all. And then Sabrina, if you want to put the closing document that includes the contact information for our various agencies. And so if people on the call who didn't get questions answered or have questions and want to learn more about what these various agencies are doing, you see the contact information for all of the great panelists that are on your screen in terms of emails and phone numbers, as well as some other resources that you may want to consider reaching out to, particularly the Court Self-Help Center, which, while it is not providing in-person services, they're available by phone, by online chats. And so just know, for all the people who are online, there are plenty of people to assist you as well. So with that, thank you. And Sabrina, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you. This has been an amazing discussion, putting elders at the forefront of the conversation, mindful of maintaining that the Family Justice Center has been open, walk-ins and for calls. We have helped many elders. Emergency housing, even during the fire crisis and very bad air quality that we had, we were able to get elders into hotels, and so that way they can definitely, like the court said, like, protect one of our most vulnerable populations. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you.